let's see. Now we're on to chapter 12. Grandfather Frog keeps on. And I want to tell you a story about my dad that happened when he was very old. He had gotten kind of deaf by that point, and I had a cat. I was living with Dad because he was quite sick with emphysema from smoking cigarettes. Do not smoke cigarettes. Cigarettes will give you lung disease and all kinds of other stuff. Don't smoke cigarettes. Um, in any event, I had a cat. I was living with Dad because Dad was sick, and I had a cat who was about 19 years old, and she was deaf too. Although she was deaf as a stone, she couldn't hear anything. And by the time she was so old, I had to start buying steak for her, London broil, and chopping it up into small pieces because that was the only thing she would eat. She wouldn't eat cat food anymore, and that was the only thing she would eat. And Dad used to always say, "I can't believe that you're feeding steak to a cat, for Pete's sakes. Cat should be eating cat food. Can't believe you're wasting money on the cat like that." Every time he would see me cutting up steak for the cat, he would say, "I can't believe you're doing this." Now, at this point in his life, Dad didn't like to buy hamburger from the store. He liked to buy a big roast and put it into the food processor and make hamburger that way. Now, I worked the overnight shift so that I could be there during the day to take Dad to his doctor's appointments and things like that. So I would get home at 6 in the morning and I'd get Dad's breakfast ready so that when he woke up, all he had to do was turn on the coffee maker and he would have his oatmeal and his little grapefruit, all ready for him. And I would then go to sleep at around 6:37 in the morning, and I would wake up around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So one afternoon, I woke up and I came downstairs, and of course, Dad didn't hear me because he was partially deaf. And I was in the dining room, and Dad was in the kitchen, and I heard him talking to somebody. Well, the only other person in the house was the cat, so I assumed he was talking to the cat. And I heard the food processor going. So I snuck over to the door of the kitchen and I looked around, and there was the cat sitting in front of Dad, and she was meowing at him. And Dad was making hamburger in the food processor. So Dad said to her, "Well, I can't believe you're still hungry. Well, all right, you can have a little bit more." And he dropped a piece of hamburger on the ground in front of her. Now he was cutting up a roast, right? And so I came around the door of the kitchen and I said, "Aha!" I said, "Here you are saying the cat shouldn't have steak, and yet you're giving her ground hamburger." And Dad, I guess he didn't want to admit that he was being hypocritical. That when you're a hypocrite, you do one thing, you say one thing, but you do another thing. And he said, "Well, I just had to shut her up because she kept meowing at me, and there was nothing I could do except feed her, the fresh ground hamburger." So I thought that was funny because he really liked the cat after all, um, and he proved it by giving her fresh ground hamburger, which I thought was very nice. All right, excuse me. Chapter 12, Grandfather Frog keeps on. Grandfather Frog is old and wise, but even age is foolish. I'm sure you'll all agree with me, his stubbornness was mulish. When somebody is being very stubborn, you can say that they're mulish, and that's because mules, which is a kind of, it's a cross between a horse and a donkey, mules can be extremely stubborn. It's very hard to get them to do what you want them to do. Okay. All right. When last we saw Grandfather Frog, Bowser the Hound had found him and was flipping him over and over again, and which must have been very terrifying for Grandfather Frog. Okay. So That his very last day had come, Grandfather Frog was sure. He didn't have the least doubt about it. Here he was at the mercy of Bowser the Hound out on the Green Meadows, far from the dear, safe, Smiling Pool. Every time he moved, Bowser flipped him over on his back and danced around him, barking with joy. Every minute Grandfather Frog expected to feel Bowser's terrible teeth, and he grew cold at the thought. When he found that he couldn't get away, he just lay still. He was too tired and frightened to do much of anything else anyway. Now, when he lay still, he spoiled Bowser's fun, for it was seeing him jump and kick his long legs that tickled Bowser so. Bowser tossed him up in the air 2 or 3 times, but Grandfather Frog simply lay where he fell without moving. "Bow wow wow!" cried Bowser in his great deep voice. Grandfather Frog didn't so much as blink his great googly eyes. Bowser sniffed him all over. "I guess I frightened him to death," said Bowser, talking to himself. "I didn't mean to do that. I just wanted to have some fun with him." With that, Bowser took one more sniff and then trotted off to try to find something more exciting. You see, he hadn't had the least intention of the world of really hurting Grandfather Frog. Grandfather Frog kept perfectly still until he was sure that Bowser was nowhere near. Then he gave a great sigh of relief and crawled under a big mullein leaf to rest and think things over. "Chug-a-rum! That was a terrible experience, it was indeed," said he to himself, shivering at the very thought of what he had been through. "Nothing like that ever happened to me in the Smiling Pool. I've always said the Smiling Pool is a better place in which to live than in the Great World. And now I know it. The question is, what had I best do now?" Now, right down in his heart, Grandfather Frog knew the answer. Of course, the best thing was to go straight back to the Smiling Pool as fast as he could. But Grandfather Frog is stubborn. Yes, sir, he is certainly stubborn. And stubbornness is often just another name for foolishness. He had been told Yeah. He had told Jerry Muskrat that he was going out to see the Great World. Now, if he went back, Jerry would laugh at him. "I won't," said Grandfather Frog. "What won't you do?" asked a voice so close to him that Grandfather Frog made a long jump before he thought. You see, at the Smiling Pool, he always jumped at the least hint of danger, and because one jump always took him into the water, he was always safe. But there was no water here, and that jump took him right out where anybody passing could see him. Then he turned around to see who had startled him so. It was Danny Meadow Mouse. "I won't go back to the Smiling Pool until I have seen the Great World," replied Grandfather Frog gruffly. "You won't see much of the Great World if you jump like that every time you get a scare," said Danny, shaking his head. "No, sir, you won't see much of the Great World, because one of these times you'll jump right into the claws of old Whitetail the Marsh Hawk, or his cousin Redtail, or Reddy Fox. You take my advice, Grandfather Frog, and go straight back to the Smiling Pool. You don't know enough about the Great World to take care of yourself." But Grandfather Frog was set in his ways, and nothing that Danny Meadow Mouse could say changed his mind in the least. "I started out to see the Great World, and I'm going to keep right on," said he. "All right," said Danny at last. "If you will, I suppose you will. I'll go a little way with you just to get you started right." "Thank you," replied Grandfather Frog. "Let's start right away." And now here's a picture of Danny and Grandfather Frog. And the caption reads, "You won't see much of the Great World if you jump like that every time you get a scare," said Danny. Uh, Chapter 13, Danny Meadow Mouse Feels Responsible. Responsible is a great big word, but it is just as big in its meaning as it is in its looks. And that is the way words should be, I think, don't you? Anyway, responsible is the way Danny Meadow Mouse felt when he found Grandfather Frog out on the Green Meadows so far from the Smiling Pool, and so stubborn that he would keep on to see the Great World instead of going back to his big green lily pad in the Smiling Pool, where he could take care of himself. You remember that Peter Rabbit felt responsible when he brought little Miss Fuzzytail down from the old pasture to the dear old briar patch. He felt that it was his business to see to it that no harm came to her, and that is just the way Danny Meadow Mouse felt about Grandfather Frog. You see, Danny knew that if Grandfather Frog was going to jump like that every time he was frightened, he wouldn't get very far in the Great World. It might be the right thing to do in the Smiling Pool, where the friendly water would hide him from his enemies, but it was just the wrong thing to do on the Green Meadows or in the Green Forest. Danny had learned, when a very tiny fellow, that the only safe thing to do when danger was near was to sit perfectly still and hardly breathe. Now, Danny Meadow Mouse is fond of Grandfather Frog, and he couldn't bear to think that something dreadful might happen to him. So when he found that he couldn't get Grandfather Frog to go back to the Smiling Pool, he made up his mind that he just had to go along with Grandfather Frog to try to keep him out of danger. Yes, sir, he just had to do it. He felt responsible for Grandfather Frog's safety. So here they were, Danny Meadow Mouse running ahead, anxious and worried, and watching sharply for signs of danger, and Grandfather Frog puffing along behind, bound to see the great world which his cousin, old Mr. Toad, said was a better place to live in than the Smiling Pool. Now, Danny has a great many private little paths under the grass all over the Green Meadows, and along these he can scamper ever so fast without once showing himself to those who may be looking for him. Of course, he started to take Grandfather Frog along one of these little paths, but Grandfather Frog doesn't walk or jump or run, he jumps. There wasn't room in Danny's little paths for jumping, as they soon found out. Grandfather Frog simply couldn't follow Danny along these little paths. Danny sat down to think and puckered his brows anxiously. He was more worried than ever. It was very clear that Grandfather Frog would have to travel out in the open, where there was room for him to jump, and where also he would be right out in plain sight of all who happened along. Once more Danny urged him to go back to the Smiling Pool, but he might just as well have talked to a stick or a stone. Grandfather Frog had started out to see the great world, and he was going to see it. Danny sighed. "If you will, I suppose," said he. "And I guess the only place you can travel in any comfort is the Lone Little Path. It is dangerous, very dangerous, but I guess you'll have to do it." "Chug-a-rum," replied Grandfather Frog. "I'm not afraid. You show me the Lone Little Path, and then go about your business, Danny Meadow Mouse." So Danny led the way to the Lone Little Path, and Grandfather Frog sighed with relief, for here he could jump without getting all tangled up in long grass and without hurting his tender feet on sharp stubble where the grass had been cut. But Danny felt more worried than ever. He wouldn't leave Grandfather Frog because, he felt responsible for him, and at the same time he was terribly afraid, for he felt sure that some of their enemies would see them. He wanted to go back, but he kept right on, and that shows just what a brave little fellow Danny Meadow Mouse was. Chapter 14. Grandfather Frog has a strange ride. Well, that doesn't sound promising. 1,000 things may happen too. 10,000 things befall the traveler who careless is or thinks he knows it all. Grandfather Frog, jumping along behind Danny Meadow Mouse up the Lone Little Path, was beginning to think that Danny was the most timid and easiest frightened of all the little meadow people of his acquaintance. Danny kept as much under the grass that overhung the Lone Little Path as he could. When there were perfectly bare places, Danny looked this way and looked that way anxiously, and then scampered across as fast as he could make his legs go. When he was safely across, he would wait for Grandfather Frog. If a shadow passed over the grass, Danny would duck under the nearest leaf and hold his breath. "Foolish," muttered Grandfather Frog. Foolish, foolish to be so afraid. Now I'm not afraid until I see something to be afraid of. Time enough then. What's the good of looking for trouble all the time? Now here I am out in the great world, and I'm not afraid. And here's Danny Meadow Mouse, who has lived here all of his life, acting as if he expected something dreadful to happen any minute. Pooh! How very, very foolish. Now, Grandfather Frog is old, and in the Smiling Pool he is accounted very, very wise. But the wisest sometimes become foolish when they think they know all there is to know. It was so with Grandfather Frog. It was he who was foolish and not Danny Meadow Mouse. You see, Danny knew all the dangers on the Green Meadows and how many sharp eyes were all the time watching for him. He had long ago learned that the only way to feel safe was to feel afraid. You see, when he was watching for danger every minute, You see, then he was watching for danger every minute, and so he wasn't likely to be surprised by his hungry enemies. So while Grandfather Frog was looking down on Danny for being so timid, Danny was really doing the wisest thing. More than that, he was really very, very brave. He was showing Grandfather Frog the way up the lone little path to see the great world, when he himself would never, never have thought of traveling anywhere but along his own secret little paths. Just because Grandfather Frog couldn't jump anywhere excepting where the way was fairly clear, as in the lone little path, and Danny was afraid that unless Grandfather Frog had someone with him to watch out for him, he would surely come to a sad end. The farther they went with nothing happening, the more foolish Danny's timid way of running and hiding seemed to Grandfather Frog, and he was just about to tell Danny just what he thought when Danny dived into the long grass and warned Grandfather Frog to do the same. But Grandfather Frog didn't. "Chug-a-rum," said he. "I don't see anything to be afraid of, and I'm not going to hide until I do." So he sat right where he was in the middle of the lone little path, looking this way and that way and seeing nothing to be afraid of. And just then, around a turn in the lone little path came, who do you think? Why, Farmer Brown's boy! He saw Grandfather Frog, and with a whoop of joy, he sprang for him. Grandfather Frog gave a frightened croak and jumped, but he was too late. Before he could jump again, Father Brown's boy had him by his long hind legs. "Ha ha!" shouted Farmer Brown's boy. "I believe this is the very old chap that I have tried so often to catch in the Smiling Pool. These legs of yours will be mighty fine eating, Mr. Frog. They will indeed." With that, he tied Grandfather Frog's legs together and went on his way across the Green Meadow, with poor old Grandfather Frog dangling from the end of a string. It was a strange ride and a most uncomfortable one. And with all his might, Grandfather Frog wished he had never thought of going out into the great world. Oh, that's terrible. Grandfather Frog is in real trouble now if Farmer Brown's boy wants to eat his legs. Next chapter is chapter 15. Grandfather Frog gives up hope, and I will tell you a story about how my father once ate frog legs, and it's a little bit of a sad story for me, anyway. I'll tell you that the next time we get together. Have a good night, boys. Bye.